You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Alma Katsu.
Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to Author Stories. I hope you are enjoying the shows as much as I'm enjoying bringing them to you. You know, as always, you can go over to hankgarner.com and click over in the right-hand sidebar and subscribe to the show. You'll never miss an episode. It costs you nothing, and it helps other people find the show. The more people subscribe, the higher we go in the rankings on iTunes and Google Play and Stitcher Radio and YouTube and everywhere we are. And thank you for doing that. I appreciate it. I'd like to thank some sponsors who, due to their generous support of the show, help bring this to you each and every time we bring you the show. From Eamon Ambrose, author of the best-selling sci-fi serial 0 Hour, comes a new novelette, Love and Other Algorithms. When Frank, a personal robot assistant, meets a similar model named Shelley, they are inexplicably linked and form an instant bond. But when outside forces conspire to separate them, Frank must decide how far he will go to save their relationship. However, all is not as it seems, and as Frank searches for Shelley, he learns that they are both part of something much, much bigger. Out now from Amazon, Love and Other Algorithms by Eamon Ambrose. Hey authors, are you looking for a beautiful professional cover for your science fiction or fantasy book? Holly Heisey Designs offers custom illustration and cover design with characters that will put your people center stage, spaceships designed from the ground up and scenery that makes your world come alive. Visit Holly Heisey Design to book a custom cover or view pre-made ebook covers ready to purchase. Holly is an award-winning illustrator and designer who's done work for the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, the Future Chronicles anthology series, and USA Today and Amazon.com best-selling authors. Holly will bring your story world to life and get you a cover that will help sell your book. Visit hollyheiseydesign.com for more information on how to book your custom cover design or purchase pre-mades, as well as join the Holly Heisey Design Facebook group for discounts and first dibs at all the new spaceship and fantasy pre-made covers. Find all of this at hollyheiseydesign.com. A Bright Shore, The Eden Chronicles, Book 1 by S.M. Anderson, a military sci-fi political thriller set just a short decade from now in 2031, holding to the concept of individual liberty can get you killed. Western civilization is in collapse, a process led and driven by the world's leading supposed democracies, our own included. What was once the Western world's guiding light of liberty is quickly being replaced by state-sponsored serfdom under the guise of a global economic reset done in the name of the workers. This is an exciting new novel by an exciting new talent, a debut novel, the first in a series from a former CIA operations officer who has decided that his lifelong writing habit, hobby, obsession is more fun than real work. Go pick up a copy today of A Bright Shore, The Eden Chronicles, Book 1 by S.M. Anderson. There's a link to all of our great sponsors in the show notes at hankgarner.com. Stick around at the end of our excellent interview today for an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. As always, thanks for listening. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Alma Katsu on the show with me. She has a brand new book that's just about to release. It's called The Hunger, and I'm really excited to talk with you today. Alma, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. This is really exciting.
Absolutely. I begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
Gosh, that's a tough one because, well, first of all, I'm very old. So
am I.
I have to go back quite a ways, and I can picture my head. I don't know if it's accurate or not, but what I really remember is the library, the public library in the town that I grew up in Maynard, Massachusetts. We moved to Maynard when I was 7 or 8 years old. I feel like I spent a lot of time in that library reading just about every book I could get my hands on. And along the line, I just guess it, materialized and I would write, that's what I would do. And so when I was a little kid, I used to write stories and, bring stories in me to school and it's crazy, but I didn't know how that would materialize. I wanted to do it for a living, but, I came from a first town and a family that was sort of, not worldly. We didn't know any writers. I didn't know one became a writer. So I kind of focused on journalism as as most visible path available to me. And I actually didn't meet my first novelist until many, many years later. But anyway, that's how it all got started.
How cool. I've talked to so many people lately that started their career in journalism. I guess that does seem kind of the most natural place to kind of dig in, isn't it? These people, they write for a living, so why not start there?
And it's pretty accessible. There was a small newspaper chain. It ended up being a big newspaper chain in the decades since I left, but at the time it was a very small local newspaper, and I actually started writing for them when I was a teenager. I guess they didn't have a lot of people who really wanted to write back then, but it allowed me to sort of get my feet wet, doing this for a living pretty early on.
Were you a bookish kid when you were young?
Oh, horribly bookish. I mean, like most writers, I guess. So I'm kind of antisocial. I'd rather read than anything else. I read everything I could get my hands on in the library. I was there so much that the librarians asked me if I wanted to become a page. Also, when I was a teenager, they thought I might as well get paid for it. And very fond memories. I probably should have become a librarian.
Well, we're happy that you didn't, so that's great. What sorts of books did you love when you were younger? What were some of the first things that opened your imagination?
Well, what was horrible is, like a lot of kids, you want to be older. Yeah. So I did read a lot of adult fiction. I read books that I probably shouldn't have read when I was a kid. I would just go through the stacks and pull out books that I thought the covers looked interesting. So I probably read some stuff. I remember the names of it, but things that, when people told me that I had very strange diction for a child, probably shaped by all that adult fiction. But, that. Yeah, as far as influencing my writing, it's probably like Edgar Allan Poe and stories like that, classics that sort of shaped my taste for darker fiction and to have some kind of fantasy element in it.
Oh, wow. So you studied journalism. Did you work as a journalist?
So I actually didn't study journalism because, again, I wouldn't advise anybody to live their life the way that I did it. But when I went to college, to university as an undergrad, and they did not have a journalism program. I went to the best school I could get into. And once I was there, my freshman year, I realized that it was probably a mistake. And I wanted to then transfer to a college that did have a good journalism program. And my parents refused to let me transfer, not because they love Brandeis, but they just had this thing about, you shouldn't quit. If you start something, you shouldn't quit it. And I'm glad I graduated from Brandeis, but I ended up graduating with my undergraduate degree was a dual track in literature and writing. And that's where I studied with John Irving. So that wasn't too bad. But I started writing as a stringer when I was a teenager, covering things that all teenagers want to cover, like, the local development board and the Chamber of Commerce and stuff like that. So I learned early on, what an unglamorous job journalism is. But later I ended up becoming a freelance music critic, and I wrote for a couple newspapers in Boston. And even when I left Boston and came down to Washington, D.C. to start working for the Defense Department, I continued working as a music critic for about a couple years, covering the Washington music scene for magazines.
Wow. I'm always fascinated by journalists who begin as stringers, like you said, and how you're able to, because I think the real art of journalism is taking the mundane and making it interesting for people. And I think there are a lot of skills that you probably pick up as a journalist that helps you later on in your career as a novelist. Do you feel the same way?
Well, it's certainly, both the gigs, the one covering local town governance and all that kind of stuff. I certainly learned a lot there. I mean, I was a teenager. I had no idea how government worked, how towns worked. It was really an eye opener. I'm sure all of the adults who were there just thought it was hysterical that this girl was writing this. It really teaches you discipline. You've got to show up. You've got to take notes. You've got to get your copy in on time. And then, of course, the music criticism was a lot more fun. I look back on it now. I think, what nerve I had to think I could be a music critic.
Right.
But it was quite an exciting time. I got to meet Prince and the Go-Go's and Joan Jett several times. And, it was very, fun. But I look back and I think, oh, what a disservice I did to those people.
Do you now look at book critics and say, oh, God, I really should have been nicer to people?
I don't envy book critics
No.
at all. I think about that a lot. I'm sure you do, too. So much of, when I wanted to become a novelist, and I got my graduate degree in writing fiction, too, and, that teaches you a lot about analyzing fiction, as you're reading it, really pulling it apart, what works, what doesn't work, all that kind of stuff. But still, you form in your mind this idea that books that get published must be good.
Right.
That only good books get published. And I realize now that that's not the case. I mean, books that have the potential to sell, that may find an audience, that's what gets published.
Right. Marketable books get published.
Right.
Yeah.
And goodness is so subjective, right? Eye of the beholder. So I feel bad for critics because, you're trying to make this objective determination about a book, but who knows, then you could just be having a bad day and you're not seeing certain things. And this book goes on to, to become a bestseller or
Right.
find this great audience, and you kind of blew it that day. I mean, I have had so many varying reviews of my books. They're all over the place, and you can't fault anybody for what they like.
Well, I think a lot of people get turned off by critics because it seems like the criticism that we see mostly is negative criticism. And as someone who was a critic, and now we live in a world where we all critique each other. Anyone can leave a review on Amazon, and those things and they do, and those things have weight. And someone, can be completely untrained, and just, their opinion matters as much as anybody else's. And we don't talk about this enough, but is there any advice that you could give people to help them to approach work more critically and in the true sense of criticism, and not just point out every negative thing, because that seems like what criticism is today.
Well, especially as you said, these days, everybody, it's the reputation economy, and anybody can leave a review on one of several sites when it comes to books or anything. And this is actually a topic that I could probably go on all day, so you can just tell me to shut up, because the last 10 years I've been involved a lot with data analytics. So, reputation economy and all that is something that we've sort of looked at a little bit, and it's a pretty frightening thing that maybe the general public isn't aware of. For instance, on Yelp, they've estimated that up to 75% of the comments left on Yelp are fraudulent. They're people who are trying to put, their direct competition out of business. There's so many services where for very little money, you can hire people to leave negative comments on things or positive comments. But there's just this whole market for that sort of thing, unfortunately. In terms of leaving comments, if you've read a book, for better or worse, you feel like you should leave a comment on Goodreads or Amazon. I think every author appreciates that when anybody's the time to talk about their book, I think all they would say is if you got something negative, just try to be as constructive about it as possible. I think some people may not realize, especially if you're new to doing that sort of thing, or maybe young, that you may not actually be right. And in a few years, you might be a little embarrassed about that thing that you wrote that was kind of naive. So, yeah. I mean, that's the one thing I'll never forget early on with the first book. this young woman on Facebook, I think. She friended me on Facebook. And then she just kept leaving all these like really pointed negative things about the book that I wrote, but they were all so wrong. Like, she would say, well, only amateurs would write a book in first person. Things
Oh my,
like
just read a book.
right. But she was so convinced of her position. God love you. I wish I were that young again. I could believe that I knew anything about it.
Oh, well, let's talk about your books, because they're absolutely magnificent. And your first trilogy is called the Taker trilogy. Where did the idea for this for the first book and then the trilogy that came out of that, where'd that come from?
Boy, I'll tell you, that trilogy has quite a history behind it. So the first book, the idea for it actually came from a short story that I wrote eons ago when dirt was forming, when I was in my 20s. And it was like a horror short story, like a ghost story. I lived in, Maynard, Massachusetts, as I said, which is near Concord, which is a very old area and just spooky as all get out. I mean, I think they're in the Guinness Book of World Records for the most graveyards per square mile. And it's just a spooky, spooky little place. And I was driving home late at night one night, and there's a full moon. I go around this bend in the road and I saw something that actually was so strange. And it was sort of the genesis for this ghost story. And then fast forward many decades, and I won't go into all of this, but, I was mid-career and I ended up getting very sick to the point where they thought I might not be able to work anymore. And just to take my mind off my medical problems at the time, I started writing. And the only thing I could think of, and I hadn't written fiction for like 20 years at this point, and the only thing that came back to me was that ghost story. I'd always wondered, like, what happened after the ghost story ended. So that was the seed for the Taker. And the Taker, as it ended up, is actually very, very different from that story or where the whole thing started. But one of the reasons I wrote the Taker is I kept thinking, I really love novels that have big, big characters, just really larger than life characters that just sweep you away. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to see if I could create characters like that. You may not like that book, but you would have to give to me that those characters are big, kind of larger than life characters. Yep. And the first book did very well. And then it actually sold as a standalone. And at the end of it, I kind of started thinking about what could have happened next. And then the following two books came to me and I pitched them to the publisher and they bought them sight unseen, just on a verbal. It was kind of different. And then I had to write them.
So tell everybody kind of what's the setup for the Taker, and where does this take place, and kind of what was the initial story idea?
So the Taker, which I gotta say, those three books are very, very different from The Hunger. Although both of them are historical with a supernatural element, the books are just so very, very different. And part of it is, I do think books, for better or worse, are a little bit of the product of the time in which they're written.
Sure.
So the Taker took me 10 years to write, and it came out 6 years ago. So, we really are talking almost 20 years ago. And so it's less of a cut and dried historical fiction. It's more in the paranormal, supernatural camp. If anything, it's probably patterned a little bit after like the early Anne Rice books. So the big part of it is the love story, and it's got the supernatural element that's not a trope. So it's not about vampires. It's not about werewolves or something like that. It has its own supernatural element. And the conceit of it is you don't find out what that is until the end of the trilogy. So the secret is actually carried through 3 books. Something is going on, but you don't know what it is. I'm terrible at summing up those books because I'm so afraid of like giving up the secret too when I do it. But you can think of it as, it was compared a lot to early Anne Rice. So like compared a lot to Interview with a Vampire, but no vampires. So it's got a lot of history. It jumps back and forth in history because some of the characters are immortal. And so you go back with them in time and you live parts of their life. And it's basically a love triangle. It's this, and it's actually, I describe it as an anti-romance. A lot of people go, oh, it's just like Twilight or something like that. It's actually the opposite of that. It's like why you don't want to fall in love with the jerk is what the story is about.
I love that.
And how your life will be, it was kind of, I'll tell you the truth, it was kind of prompted by a niece of mine who was just in love with the idea of being in love. And she had fallen in love with the wrong person. And I saw so many women like that, so many girls who love was, falling in love was the goal of their life. And I wanted to write a story that kind of showed why you shouldn't be like that.
I love that. I was going to draw the comparison between that trilogy and early Anne Rice. One thing that makes Anne's work so really three-dimensional is her use of place. New Orleans almost becomes a character in her books. Yeah. Being from Massachusetts, do you feel that sense of place as well, and did it come through in your writing?
I think so. A good part of it was set in Maine, and while I didn't grow up in Maine, I spent some time there. I understood New England really well. One of the things is growing up in that area of Massachusetts, so near Concord, I used to call it colonial ground zero because everywhere you went, you were surrounded by colonial Massachusetts. And it's funny, growing up, I never thought that had made a big influence on me. And then I wrote that book, and it all came through in my subconscious. It's also not the sexiest period of time to be writing about, but you write what you have, right? I grew up in, and that's what I knew.
So you published the trilogy, and you talked about that book and that series is really a product of the time. Your new book, is very different. Tell us about the book and where the idea for The Hunger came from.
So, it's very interesting. It was a different kind of project for me in another regard. And that is, it's done in partnership with a company. It's, I guess they're called like a media consulting company. It's Glasstown Entertainment. It used to be known as Paper Lantern Lit. And basically they produce a lot of ideas for books. But they transition to multimedia. So they actually approached my agent and said this was their first adult title. They are very big in YA. They've only been around a few years, but they've been super, super successful. The two principals are both best-selling authors themselves, Lauren Oliver and Lexa Hillier. So they approached my agent and asked if I would be interested in doing it. And the premise was so interesting. Basically, it's a log line. It's the Donner Party meets the Walking Dead. And I thought, what genius. Why didn't someone think of this before? But the interesting thing was the concept was that it wasn't zombies. I mean, it didn't define what the horror element was, which really appeals to me. Because if nothing else, I really, really hate boring cliched ground with stories that have been done over and over again. I like to try to find something new in it. So I thought this would be a really interesting experiment. First of all, it would give me the opportunity to work with two very talented writers. And as you know, writing is a very solitary thing. At the end of the process, you have your agent weighing in and you have your editor weighing in. But it's easy to get into bad habits, I find, and very few people there to tell you, you're running over, or this is boring, or that character really rubs me the wrong way. And so I thought, well, this will be interesting to kind of have a bit more of a workshop experience going on. And so that is what happened there. So it's really, I liken it more to writing for television in a way. It's not so much the one writer's sole vision as it is, you've got a body of very creative people. And in the case of my partners, very experienced. The editor on the project, Sally Kim at Putnam, also, had a good bit of say in the book, gave us a lot of direction, which all made for, I think, a much stronger book. So it really is quite an ambitious book. It stayed very close to the history, introduced this this very mysterious supernatural element. It's an ensemble book because you follow a handful of main characters as opposed to having just one protagonist and one antagonist. And I'm so pleased with how it turned out.
The Donner Party story is something that still captures people's imaginations, and it is because it really shows just how far down we can spiral if left to our own devices. What possessed you to tackle this piece of history, and what kind of research did you do into the Donner Party?
I love to ask people. When I got started, I started asking people, have you ever heard of the Donner Party? What do you know about them? And I found out that a certain generation, I guess they stopped teaching it in schools, but when I went to school, at least you heard about it. But there's a certain part of the population that isn't even sure, apparently, if it was real or if it was just a made-up story. So, like a lot of people, I'd heard of it, but I didn't really know the details. And once I started doing research, oh my God, such an interesting story. I mean, for instance, I don't know if most people know, there were about 100 people in that wagon party. If you could picture 100 people together, now picture trying to get them through snow that's several times over their head, up a mountain pass. Picture how much food you need just to feed 100 people every day. Where is this food going to come from? I mean, you really get a sense of the magnitude of the problem. It wasn't just a couple people in trouble, and half of them were children. So they were families trying to figure out, how am I going to keep my children alive? That's just part of it. So, so for one thing, there's like all of these incredible dramatic possibilities within the story. The cast of characters were just amazing. As I said, you had families trying to keep them alive. You had immigrants, people who just come off the boat to America who didn't even speak English, who were part of this wagon train, people who had given up everything, sold all their possessions in this kind of last-ditch effort to try to find their fortune in this completely unknown land where there weren't even maps for how to get there. And then, on top of that, very tight, because really what it comes down to is the question of survival. What would you do? You knew you were about to die, line would cross to stay alive. And so that's one thing that just makes for a great story, right? You as an author, I'm sure you can appreciate that. And then you have like these really big themes that run through it that kind of resonate even today, with Manifest Destiny. Is this the future that America was supposed to have? I mean, that's why people started the westward migration, because they believed that it was, America's destiny to be 100 sea to sea, that we settlers should conquer all this unknown. There were religious issues tied up in that. There was, of course, issues with the treatment of Native Americans as they were moving through there. There are political issues. There's a lot of things, I don't want to get too political on your show, that really resonate with what we're going through today. So the story really, I think, will talk to readers on so many levels.
Well, as a writer, when you hear a story like the Donner Party and you start, because that's what we do as writers, we hear something and we're like, oh my God, how could that have happened? And you start working it over in your brain. And I've had news stories or historical stories like this that just wouldn't let me go, because once it takes root, all of the different possibilities start. Did you ever feel a little morbid that this was the story that had really taken root in you?
Well, people who know me will tell you I'm probably one of the most morbid. So no, it didn't bother me at all. It's funny. Maybe, right? Because some things, I guess, only seem real to you when you're a writer and you're turning it over in your mind. I can't really imagine what cannibalism must be, for instance. You have sort of detached thing where you think about it and you can read about actual cannibal incidents. As you know, you have to do a lot of these kinds of things. So I did read a lot about actual cannibalism, and it was more common than most of us in our age, especially before when ships were still the main mode of transportation between land masses, it actually happened a lot more because of shipwrecks, people being, lost at sea. It was part of the law of the sea. So actually there was a lot more cannibalism back then, than we have today. Anyway, sorry, I keep going on. You can draw me back at any point.
No. But what I was going to say is the fun part of being a writer is to take these stories and start thinking of all the possibilities. But then if you write things that have a fantasy element or maybe a supernatural element like you do, the possibilities of what you can do with a story like that really kind of blow up. When did you decide? And don't talk any more than you want to without giving stuff away. But when did you decide on what the supernatural twist for the book was going to be? How did you weave that into it?
Well, we kind of tried on a couple different things. I don't think it ever really changed. Like the tenor of it didn't change. It's really more for sort of suspense running through it. You feel this threat. And what the actual threat is, and whether it's real or imagined, ended up being kind of left a little up in the air towards the end of the book. So far, no one's complained that they felt it wasn't satisfactory. That was something I had worried about a lot, especially, when you think about writing within a genre. And I wouldn't say this is strictly a horror genre, but if you were to, wanted to produce a book that would be clearly seen as a horror novel, then I think that's something we would have had to resolve more clearly in the page.
So how long did this book take you to write? You said you worked on the first one in the Taker trilogy for like 10 years. Was this a whole different experience? Yeah,
luckily I'm speeding up. I'm trying to think. I guess it was about 18 months. But part of the issue was working with a partner. So there was a lot of iteration, and we did end up changing some aspects of the book over time. And a part of that too is just learning to work with each other, because we're three very different writers as well. So kind of finding that balance between us. We are actually working on the next book. It's another standalone. It's not related to The Hunger at all, but it's sort of the same thing. It's historical with a supernatural element. And this time is going by much more quickly because we're so used to working with each other.
That's awesome. The new book is called The Hunger. Alma, I can't wait for it to get out and for everyone to read it. This book is going to be amazing. If people are just discovering you for the first time, where can they find your work and follow along with what's going on?
Probably the easiest way is to go to my website, almakatsubooks.com. I'm going to start ramping up my social media presence. So you can follow me on Twitter at Alma Katsu, just all together. Same thing on Instagram, although I'll warn you, you're going to see a lot of pictures of my new puppy on Instagram.
We love it.
And also on Facebook, Alma Katsu author on Facebook.
Awesome. Alma, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Jason and Joey took their food trays outside and sat high above the parking lot on the secluded stairwell that had become their lunchtime hangout, picking at their Thanksgiving specials and swapping updates. They were almost finished eating before Jason managed to screw up the courage to say what he needed to. "I want to apologize." Joey looked puzzled. "What the hell for?" "Because your coma was my fault." "Yours? The horseman beamed me. You didn't." "Hey, want to see something cool? Look what I found on my phone." Joey produced the device, hit a few buttons, and swiped his finger. An orange circle hung in a field of black, overexposed, something that had been moving fast when the flash caught it. "I was trying to get his picture, right? Like an idiot? Well, I didn't get him, but that is the pumpkin he threw at me." Jason stared at the blurry orange shape for a long time. "Cool." "Cool? Can you imagine if we actually got a picture of the Headless Horseman? We'd be famous by now." He pocketed the phone. Hey, do you want the rest of this turkey? It looks like bologna. Tastes like bologna, too. He speared the slice anyway. Look, this is going to sound weird, but I think I made you a target. What do you mean? I made you a target by telling you about my gift. It's some sort of magical rule. If we reveal ourselves to a normal person, whoever we tell becomes a target for ghosts. And usually, they die. And you told me anyway? No, I'd already told you. There was no way to untell you. Don't be mad. It all worked out, right? Right? Joey's expression had darkened. Give me a second here. And there's a bright side. What bright side? Now you'll have a gift too. Me? That's what your coma was. Some kind of transition. You got targeted, but you survived. You'll be a founder now, like Ichabod. You'll pass your gift to your kids like he passed his to me. Joey looked worried. What kind of gift will I get? People get gifts that complement their natural abilities. It could be anything. Anything? So, I could read minds? I guess. Turn purple and levitate? Probably not. Something that expresses the essential you. Then I'll have an actor's gift. What's an actor's gift? Jason shrugged. Super narcissism? Shut up. So you're not mad? Joey was shaking with excitement. Mad? This is the coolest thing ever! We'll be like the dynamic duo, fighting supernatural foes up and down the eastern seaboard. Jason laughed, feeling epic relief. I thought you'd be pissed. Nah. What's a little coma between friends? He took a bite out of a Nutter Butter, grinning madly. I'm going to be a superhero. But you can't tell anyone. Why not? Weren't you listening? Everyone we tell dies. You can't talk about your gift to anybody. But if they were targeted and lived, we could have our own X-Men. Yeah, or all your friends could die. Do you want to risk that? No, I guess not. But I don't do closets very well, you know? I came out at conception. Promise to keep it to yourself. Yeah. Joey shifted sideways and walked his sneakers up the brick. So, the essential me. Ooh, I know what gift I'll get. I'll get a singer's gift. What's a singer's gift? Jason shrugged. Superhuman drug tolerance? Shut up!